Wonderful, thank you. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I would just like to briefly explain the structure of the webinar today. First, Camille and Glynis will speak about the importance of the school having clear principles to guide the shaping of EAL provision before they speak about the roles and responsibilities of different members of school staff in terms of the provision for learners using EAL. And then Camille and Glynis will also look more closely at planning that provision, and there will be opportunities to share relevant resources along the way. Okay, if there's time at the end, they both will answer questions that you might pose. So feel free, if you do have any questions, again, to put those in the question and answer function, and we will look at those at the end if there is time. Okay, tomorrow you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. And before I introduce our speakers, though, it would be good at this time to quickly look at some of the results of those polls, if Lizzie can kind of tell us what we have found. So it looks like here the teaching assistant, if your role is teaching assistants, we have 7%, EAL teachers 13%, and subject class teachers are 5%. EAL coordinators, mainly of those of you are 61% here. So that's great. Is there the next one, Lizzie?
Yes, you can just scroll down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Makes sense. Okay. And please only answer the next two questions if you're lead in your school trust. How long have you been in your role? It looks like many of you are new this year. So welcome to that role for many of you. And then you can see the results here too, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, more than 5 years, all between 14 and 20%. So we've got people from a range of years that they have been with us. This is the one that we're really quite interested in, is how would you score the EAL training that you received prior to beginning your role? And as we can see here, 46% of you have received no training at all, and very few have received a fair amount of support. So we're not surprised by this, and we hear this regularly, and so that is why we're hoping that today the webinar here will support those of you who are just beginning in the role, and we hope that we can provide you the training that will be supportive. So thanks for taking those polls. I want to, enough of me at this point. Now I would like to give great pleasure to introduce you to both Glynis Lloyd and to Camille Trebiatowski today. They are both turning on their cameras, so you will see them with us. Glynis, she joined the Bell Foundation in 2022 as a trainer, so just recently. She has worked in English language education as a teacher trainer, textbook writer, and a commissioning editor. She holds an M.Ed in Applied Language and Linguistics and a PGCE. She has undertaken research in literacy and teacher development projects in EAL contexts in both South Africa and in Ghana. She works on course design and resource development for teachers in EAL settings. Camille, he joined the Bell Foundation in September of 2018. He holds the post of digital resource developer. Before joining the foundation, Camille had spent 18 years teaching English as a foreign language and English as an additional language, first in Poland and then subsequently in England and Scotland in mainstream secondary classrooms. He was an EAL coordinator, as many of you are, as a secondary school. He's an EAL consultant, a trainer, a writer for education periodicals, and EAL event organizer. So we're very happy to have them with us here today. I will turn it over to them now.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. So I'm going to move on to our learning intentions, but first of all, warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Okay, so first let's have a look what we hope to achieve in today's session. So In this session, you will learn about the principles that underpin effective EAL provision. We'll consider what the role and responsibilities of coordinators, which is your role, are. We'll look at how to plan the development of EAL provision and aim to effect school-wide change. And of course, practical stuff. Familiarize yourself with the selection of applicable EAL resources. And we hope that thanks to this, you will be able to lead EAL provision in your school, and in so doing, better serve the needs of learners using EAL. So you can see what sections we'll go through today. We are going to start from guiding principles. So again, what underpins effective EAL provision in a school. So first, we're going to actually have another poll. And I'm just going to ask you this question. So you can see the number of all the pupils in England, 8,911,853. How many of those students do you think are classified as using English as a natural language? And you've got A, B, C, D there. If you could choose one, and within 1 minute, I'm going to show you the answer on the next screen. Okay, let's just wait for a few seconds. Okay, that was probably enough time. Can we see the results first before I move on? So, so we've got 47% of you thought it was over 1.5 million, and 40% over 2 million. So that's obviously almost 90% of you thinking around these answers. Thank you very much. So those of you who voted C are correct. So it is almost 1 in 5 students in England, and it is, as you can see, 19.5%. So this means that this is highly unlikely that a teacher working in England would not encounter a learner who uses EAL in their classroom in their teaching career. And that includes teachers who might teach in more rural areas. And so while this group of learners might be a minority, it is certainly a sizable minority. And so even more reason to ensure that our provision for this group is of high quality. Now, there's some anecdotal evidence that there are more new EAL coordinators in some schools receiving children who are refugees, but who, by who I mean coordinators, have previously little or no experience of teaching or coordinating EAL. So it is very important to remember that provision in schools, although it is of course important for refugee learners, needs to extend beyond them to support all learners who use EAL. And it's also important to consider your context, the context of your school, in determining the nature of your provision. So for example, how many learners new to English there are versus more learners who are more competent in English language proficiency. Okay. And here you've got also some breakdown of some of these numbers into, as you can see, nurseries, primary schools, and you can see secondary schools there, 17.5%, and the number of pupils in PRU units. Okay. Can I now ask you to put into a chat box just one line, perhaps the first thing that comes to your mind, what is a challenge in your work as EAL coordinator? And that will lead us to consider what kind of issues we might be dealing with. So if you just could write one line, one challenge that you've already come across perhaps, or you know of, that coordinators face. So workload, curriculum in English schools, time, budgets, lots of time, lots of budget, lots of workloads, high volume, unfamiliarity. So there's clear three themes coming through your responses: workload, time, and no money, essentially. I'm just scrolling very quickly just to get an idea of what kind of themes, but the others, and resources to use with the students. Okay, thank you very much. That's fantastic. So we're going to look at those issues in some detail on this next slide. So, okay, so what are the potential issues? Well, the first is this. In the more recent government documents, such as Ofsted's new education inspection framework, the term EAL is in fact quite invisible in that it's not specifically mentioned as a distinct group. Rather, all students encompassing terms such as learners or all learners are used. And in some respects, of course, this could be seen as positive. That's to say, then these learners are not othered or portrayed as different from other learners in schools, but it does also mean that their distinct needs, that is to say, those stemming from the English language barrier, might be missed or forgotten about. Secondly, in the past, funding available for those learners was ring-fenced, available to be spent only on this group of learners by the schools. But this is no longer possible, and particularly in light of what I just mentioned, the invisibility of EAL, this will often mean very small budgets in schools, and a number of you mentioned that. Budgets available for resources that multilingual learners might benefit from. So some schools, for instance, choose to use their pupil premium funds for resourcing learners using EAL. In fact, I have done that before in my teaching career, because that's how I could procure some funds for resources for my learners. The fact that schools are typically no longer accountable to local authorities can mean that they might choose to deprioritize the needs of learners using EAL and support this group less than they might otherwise be the case. In the past, some local authorities set up a central EAL resource center in a city where practitioners could borrow books, access resources, and in some cases even training. But again, this no longer applies, meaning that teachers and coordinators typically need to do their own research and apply for their own training sessions and courses. And training. There are no qualifications required for the position of the EAL coordinator and EAL teacher, in fact, meaning that sometimes EAL staff are not trained for this demanding role. They're unsure what is required of them. Training, and particularly face-to-face training, can be difficult to find or get to. Then many of you mentioned time. So there might be little time to do the job. Sometimes one member of staff has two roles. So for example, a mainstream classroom teacher and EAL coordinator. Perhaps that's some of you are in that position. And then they will have only a few hours per week available for the coordination of EAL, and that will not be sufficient to serve the needs of those learners. Some staff already have other specific role responsibilities, so they could be SEN coordinators who are given EAL coordination duties. We will be talking more about SEN and EAL later today. And finally, there are times where the description itself of the role of EAL coordinator is vague and not clear. The job requirements can in fact vary greatly from school to school for this role. And so as much as possible, it is in the interest of a coordinator to know exactly what is expected of them before the job starts. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Glynis, who is going to, as you can see, tell you more about those guiding principles.
Thank you, Camille, and hello, everyone. So yes, I'd like to start with this point about guiding principles, because research has shown us that to organize effective EAL provision in any school, certain guiding principles need to be adopted to underpin your practice. So what would those be? we look then at the work of a team of researchers based mainly at Cambridge University, a team that includes Professor Evans. And he says that they say that it's crucial to create a culture where values around the inclusion of EAL students are explicit and shared across the school, and that makes for a coherent, cohesive foundation that you can then build on and build your policies and your practice. So they then go on, this team of researchers go on to talk about what an inclusive pedagogy might look like. And they've identified 4 key dimensions of inclusion. And I'm going to talk a bit to each one of them. So the first one we would talk about is academic inclusion. Second is linguistic inclusion. Third is teachers' inclusive attitudes. And fourth is social inclusion. And all of these put together really explain why we say that the very best strategies are to create multilingual classrooms, and that children who are learning English as an additional language should be in the mainstream, in mainstream classes from as soon after they start as possible. And even if you feel that you need to do some EAL induction at the beginning, what is good practice is always to get those children into mainstream classrooms as soon as possible, and to make any induction really very short term. So let's look at the first dimension then, academic inclusion, and what that might mean for learners using EAL. And of course, running through all of this, we want to highlight the importance of language for learning and recognize that schooling is a fundamentally linguistic process. And all of the points I'm going to make now are really based on that idea. So first of all, we would welcome and include learners using EAL into mainstream classes. As I've said, they need to feel secure in the learning environment. And so welcoming is partly including opportunities for them to use the language that they know, and also then to arrange things like having a buddy, an empathetic child who can accompany them, who can be part of the activities in the classroom, and just help them feel welcome and take them through what's going on. Secondly, as with all children, you set and maintain high expectations in the programs that you're going to draw up. And so at this point, really to make the point that there's no need for dumbing down of the curriculum. For example, a learner might be very good at maths, and really it's the language support that they need to access the maths curriculum. The third point will be, apologies for that. The third point there is to take advantage of each individual child's strengths and talents. And we'll talk a bit later about getting a good profile of the child, of the student. But for example, finding out what their strong subjects are. They might be very good at chess and be able to teach other children to play chess, for example. And that's part of really welcoming and including them. And the last point there is to recognize the language profile and education history of each child. This is something we'll talk about a bit later, and that you will do before the admission, and that it's important that this information is then shared to any teacher who might be teaching that particular student. The next issue with academic inclusion is the issue of students learning English as an additional language and children who might have special education needs. And it's really important that these two things are not confused or conflated, that there's a clear separation between children who are learning English as an additional language and those who may, like in any population, a small minority may have a special education need. And we'll be adding links to useful resources that you can use. If you do think, for example, that a child might be dyslexic or have another special need, how would you assess them as an English additional language student? Okay, I can now move. Yes, sorry, that we'll be sending you new guidance and resources that will enable you to check for special education needs. The second dimension then is the question of linguistic inclusion. And in understanding this, a very important point is to acknowledge that our language or languages form a very significant part of our identity. And so including the languages that your children speak in your school and in their learning means that you are affirming and recognizing who they are. So what are some of the things that you would do? So first of all is to create a multilingual school environment. And there's so many ways that that can happen, like putting up signs around the school in multiple languages, celebrating Language Day, having events that celebrate multilingualism, and making sure in that way that all the languages of all of your students are part of the fabric of your school. And secondly, for the student themselves, it's about seeing multilingualism as an asset. And we'll be talking a lot about assets and this asset-based approach through the webinar today. But it means recognizing, one part of that means recognizing that multilingual children have a rich language repertoire. They know language, they know about language. When they're learning a second language, they can see differences between language. They learn how languages work and so on. And they already will have extensive language and learning in the languages that they know. And you can use that rich repertoire for their learning across the curriculum. So basically what we're saying is that the languages that they bring are an asset to their learning, to their classrooms, and that all the children in the class can benefit from knowledge of multiple languages. And this is what we mean by the asset-based approach. Secondly, on this point, we really speak about the fact that children learning EAL have two jobs. They have to learn English and they have to learn in English. And so, of course, that has implications for the pedagogy. And it means what we say is that every teacher is a language teacher. So we're teaching English, but we're also teaching language for the curriculum, which means, for example, that every teacher needs to think about what the language challenges might be in a particular lesson. So, for example, if it's science, it's thinking about identifying key concepts, perhaps translating those concepts into the languages that the learner knows, and so on. It means looking at the particular ways we use language in that subject. In science, we use the passive voice a lot, for example. We use procedures. We use first, second, and third in a procedure if it's an experiment. So it's about thinking about that language, foregrounding it, and making that explicit as a way of creating frameworks that the students can use. The third dimension then is teachers' inclusive attitudes. And here this really goes to a part of your role which hopefully includes that you're enabled to do is training through for all of your staff. And this is about really making sure that teachers see new arrivals as assets. As I've said, that they bring a richness and a diversity to classrooms. They can have a really good impact on all of the students in the school. We've seen head teachers talk about the fact that new arrivals have raised the aspirations of the whole school body. So there can be really positive outcomes for everyone. And then the last dimension is the issue of social inclusion. And really this is just to make absolutely sure that new learners who are learning EAL are included in all school activities, whatever that may be, in the classroom, outside of the classroom, outings and so on, that they're part of everything, and that steps are taken to make sure that they're supported and included all the way through those activities. So I'm going to move now to the question of the EAL policy in your school. And because so many of you are new in this role, it's very possible that you may not have a policy yet. If you do, perhaps the points I'm going to raise now will give you an opportunity to review that policy and see where you can possibly strengthen, tweak it, and so on. So there are a number of points that we would suggest that you could include in your policy. And first of all, would be the issue of values and vision. As we've mentioned, resting your policy on a view of inclusion and equity, and that includes a definition of English additional language and bilingual or multilingual students, and then your school's position on language and identity, the access that all students should have to the curriculum, and the fact that you use their full linguistic repertoire in their learning. Secondly, you'll think about your school context and set out all the languages, cultures, and ethnicities that are represented in your school, and the number of languages that are represented, and then the number or percentage of children who are learning English as an additional language, their profiles and their proficiencies. And perhaps the number of pupils who qualify for the pupil premium. Thirdly, we'd talk about key responsibilities, and that really goes to everybody in the school. What is everybody's responsibility to support EAL provision? That includes members of your senior leadership team, what their responsibilities might be, what governors' responsibility might be, yours as the coordinator, and any other staff member who is teaching, supporting children who are learning EAL. Then the next part of your policy would be to look at the expectations for teaching and learning and the assessment of learners who are using EAL. So you'd set out your strategies for supporting access to the mainstream curriculum, including teaching strategies, adaptive techniques you might be drawing on, resources you might need and draw on, and any intervention sessions that you might see that are necessary. Secondly, would be planning language development, and then the big question of assessment, target setting, and tracking. And Camille will be coming back to these points later. The next point would be the procedures for the admission and induction of new arrivals. So what preparation do you put in place prior to admission? What liaison will you do with the family? And I'll talk about that a bit more later. And what support can you put in place in the first days after the student joins your school, and identifying any learning needs that they may have. Our sixth point is the issue of special education needs and EAL. So it's identifying any students who might have SEN needs and what support protocols you can put in place for them. Then a key factor, and this goes to the fact, of how many teachers and EAL coordinators have had an opportunity for CPD, trying to build a program into your policy where staff can access training. And again, we'll be sharing links for some of the training that the Bell Foundation provides. Second last is the issue of family engagement and working with the wider community. What are your policies in that regard? And then lastly, just a point about when your policy will be reviewed and evaluated and who will do that. So at this point, I'll hand back to Camille.
Thank you. Thank you, Glynis. So now we are going to look at the role and responsibilities of EAL coordinators. And actually in this section will also include some comments about what your responsibilities are not as well. But I will talk about this in a second. So let's move on. Okay, so a lot of what you're going to see on the slides is not to be taken as listed in the order of importance or of priority. The priorities will depend on your school's context and the needs of your learners and many other factors. But we're going to have a look at a number of these responsibilities. So we're going to start with this one. So typically on admission, schools will already know that learners coming to them are those using EAL, particularly if they are new arrivals who are new to English. But there will be situations where some analysis will be required. So, for example, learners might be children of mixed heritage, ethnicity parents. I once had a Thai learner whose name was Watson, so it wasn't immediately obvious from the paperwork before she arrived that she might belong to that group. And sometimes the information about a learner's language might be missing from the admission form. Sometimes there are issues on what information flows into secondary schools from primary schools, and so there might be more digging required. But more importantly, your role will include keeping records of those learners, and most likely in the form of a kind of a EAL register with information about such as languages, ethnicity, obviously current English language proficiency, level or band of a learner recorded. Now this links to the next two aspects of the role, monitoring their progress and tracking their attainment, which should be preceded by assessment of their language development needs. The assessment of the English language using a tool such as our EAL assessment framework for schools should be done at least 2 weeks after, after at least 2 weeks have passed after a learner's first day in school. Otherwise, you will end up with a situation where the results are skewed just simply due to the fact that the learner was anxious, stressed on their first day in school and dealing with the entirely new environment in a new country. Assessing their language will also assess not only the English language, but learners' home literacy, ideally, if you are able to do so. There's a page on our website called Home Language Assessment, which is a guide to how you might want to approach this. And we will be sharing this with you at the time when we are sharing the recording of this webinar. So a lot of the things that we're talking about will be sent to you tomorrow. I just like to stress that the assessment itself does not necessarily need to be conducted by the coordinator. It could be a TA or another teacher, but it should be somebody who is trained for the task and know what to do. Monitoring progress refers not only to curricular progress, but also progress in the English language development. So this will enable to determine more firmly if learners struggle with a particular subject or academic domain, if the issue is because of the English language barrier, or because of the knowledge or abilities to do with the subject itself. In other words, is the issue with the content in science or with the language of science? And so ideally, the English language assessment will not just be the job of the EAL coordinator, who can't be everywhere at school, of course, but subject teachers can monitor it too, but this required them to be trained. And we're coming back to what Glynis was talking about just a few seconds ago about CPD. That's not just for yourself, but also for other teachers. And so they would need to understand how the framework, any framework you would employ, works, which leads us to the next point. So one of the responsibilities of EAL coordinators is supporting teachers via CPD. If you feel knowledgeable enough in order to be able to do so, of course, it can be yourself, and this could be through a formal insight session, individual conversations, informal sessions delivered to smaller groups of teachers or TAs, and perhaps even arranging a weekly EAL drop-in time where teachers could come in and ask for advice in your own classroom. But it is equally possible to simply point to help arrange external training coming into the school, such as alerting the school to courses such as the ones that we run. Of course, this CPD, formal or informal, will not be limited to EAL assessment and can cover a number of different areas: teaching and learning, EAL strategies for the classroom, and EAL resources for teachers. This could be a daunting task sometimes, but it is important. Many things simply cannot be done without an input or agreement with from the SLT. Certainly funding, which you mentioned a lot before, for funding for certain resources you purchase, or working towards multilingual ethos that you would want to set up across the school, organizing instant sessions and so on. It is obviously important to then do your best to involve the senior leaders. And then helping to ensure that curriculum resources reflect school diversity. So where learners see that resources and programs of learning reflect the experiences of pupils, students such as themselves, they will feel more included in the school community, which is likely to increase their motivation and, of course, their commitment to learning and sense of belonging. Supporting parents to support their children's learning is important as well. Where parents and carers of learners are more involved, it can only help children to succeed. Parents of multilingual learners might sometimes feel that they are unable to help them with homework and schoolwork, particularly where they themselves are new to English. But it is useful to remind them that they can support learning in their own home language as well. And we'll suggest some more ideas about that later in the webinar. And finally, planning, teaching and monitoring support. So this relates to organizing an induction program. There will be some resources and links at the end of the webinar about that. But there won't be enough time in today's webinar to go into it in completely full detail. But we would suggest that EAL induction be time limited. That is to say that it shouldn't be longer than 12 weeks or 2 half terms, and always linked to the curriculum, in light of the fact that learners who use EAL learn English and through English. This aspect also relates to organizing other support offered to learners using EAL. So if you're in the fortunate position to have TAs that you could deploy to support learners using EAL, you would need to determine how to deploy them and during which lessons, which times to offer support. If you want to offer any particular short-term intervention program to any learners, then you would need to work with the teachers as well. And just finally, before we move on to the next section, I mentioned that I would talk about a bit about what is not your responsibility. It is not your responsibility. Sorry, it is every teacher's responsibility to teach all learners, regardless of whether they are they use English as a national language or not. But it is not your responsibility to be coming into subject lessons and relieving other teachers of their responsibility to do so. And also, for example, to organize withdrawal outside of the mainstream classroom where they could be supported by the teacher in their classroom. But obviously you can support those teachers in supporting those learners in their own classrooms. So teachers' standard states quite clearly that it is all teachers' responsibility to teach learners. And so it's important to remember that. Okay, so I'm going to now move on to planning EAL provision. And we're going to start with, as you can see here, a long-term plan. So So it's important that you have a long-term plan and with realistic objectives that you could work towards. So an effective and workable EAL action plan puts you in charge and enables you to lead, but it also draws in your colleagues and involves the SLT, senior leaders. The more of your colleagues know about EAL pedagogy, EAL approaches, strategies, resources, assessment, the better the provision will be, and it will be more consistent across the school. And so the EAL action plan that you can see here on the screenshot comes from one of our courses. That's a template on one of our courses that we use. And as you can see here, it includes responsibilities, who is responsible for which aspect, realistic timescales, resources, that includes human resources as well, what impact you expect them to have on children's learning and children's inclusion, and finally, what evidence you would be able to produce to show that evidence to other members of staff, potentially senior leaders. Okay. Another thing to say is that in the planning, the long-term planning, it's useful to consider how you might integrate EAL with other areas of the school, such as some of the ones you see here, SEN, CPD, pastoral support, safeguarding, more. Now, the long-term plan, 2 slides ago, will include planning for admission and induction of new arrivals who use EAL, as it is an important part of the provision. So during this admission induction process, we would suggest that EAL profiles are written for those learners, but obviously not everyone, because you wouldn't be able to do that for everyone. So most likely it would be for learners who are new to English, but certainly not all of them. You need to consider your workload, which many of you mentioned already. But the screenshots on the right here is our own EAL profile template, and it is downloadable from our website. And as you can already see, we suggest that these profiles should be shared with other staff, not just the teachers, could be shared as well with pastoral leads, for example, pastoral workers. They should encourage teachers to see the unique nature of each child, and they could have information helping other teachers devise support and expectations for that child. So there might be, you might include potential strategies for teachers to use in their classroom, perhaps a short list relevant to the English language level of proficiency that learner is at that time. Okay. So broadly speaking, we can think of EAL provision by using these 3 different foci or focuses that you can see here. So we'll consider one by one in this section just now. And we'll start with this one, whole school ethos. So I'm going to ask you to put into the chat box, share one idea how you would promote a multilingual culture in your school. And we'll have a look what ideas you have. Just one idea. How could that happen in a school? Signs and posters. Thank you, Joe. World Languages Day, Culture Day, multilingual signs, basic phrases. Yes, absolutely. Lots of the same kind of ideas that we would have. Assemblies, language cafe, key vocabulary in different languages, lots of displays, a home language club. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Huge amounts of ideas there. Thank you so much. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to show what our ideas are. So So we want to integrate learners in all school activities, and particularly with new arrivals who are new to English, you could set up buddy schemes for them. And one such excellent program to help you do that is Young Interpreters Scheme from Hampshire County Council, which trains learners into such a role. So then if they share the language of a learner who is new to English, who's just coming to the school, they could help them around the school in the first weeks. Secondly, EAL training for staff, for subject teachers and for teaching assistants can and perhaps should have a multilingual focus, or at least an aspect of it. And this is also a good time to address any concerns that staff might have about the use of home language in school, in their classrooms, in everyday school life. And multilingualism can be promoted across the school, and here our ideas are precisely what you just put into the chat. Basic phrases, such as teachers can also learn basic phrases in different languages, of course. Different languages can be visible throughout the school, so that all learners, not only those who use EAL, can see that linguistic diversity in the school. Okay, I'm now going to have a look at teaching and learning. So what underpins the effective pedagogy for multilingual learners? So given what we have just said about multilingualism as an asset is to be harnessed. Secondly, teachers should have high expectations on multilingual learners as long as they provide appropriate support to remove the English language barriers to the curriculum for them. And thirdly, teaching and learning integrates content and language. And effective and holistic assessments carried out in the first place will inform these three principles and enable teachers and TAs to support those learners in the classroom. So it is only when you know what the strengths and the needs of those learners are that you can pitch your support at the correct level. Okay. So we want to incorporate the multilingual and the multicultural aspects of the school into the ethos and encourage children to draw on the languages that they know. In terms of high expectations, so maintaining high expectations for every student has long been perceived as a crucial aspect of learners' education, and it's linked to the Pygmalion effect introduced by Rosenthal quite a long time ago. And following their school research, Rosenthal held that high expectations lead to better performance and low expectations to lower performance or worse performance. If a teacher holds low expectations of a learner, the pupil might behave in such a way that confirms the teacher's pre-existing expectations, but also the vice versa is true. And so a learner having low confidence in themselves can thus become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is, as you can see here, a false definition of the situation, evoking a behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. Regarding the learners using EAL, some teachers might take their English language barrier to learning, mean that they are capable of less, leading to lower expectations of them. But a language barrier has little to do with cognitive abilities and giftedness for maths, for example. So when we think of high expectations, what is common to all is that's common to all learners. This is the maintenance of high expectation as crucial for reaching full academic potential, and all learners need to be enabled to access the entire curriculum. But specific to EAL is that the English language barrier need not be a reason for lowering expectations, and language barriers can be removed for learners to engage with the curriculum. So therefore, in other words, if we remove the English language barriers whilst developing their English language, we then can expect high of them, just like of everyone else in our classrooms. Okay. Now, we talked about integrated focus on content and language. So I'm going to share with you two examples of our own resources from our teaching resources page on our website. Here is one from Probability, the most recent one, which is a substitution table for a lesson in maths. And You can see, and this is designed for learners who are closer to new to English. Now, as you can see here, we've got the tense there are, we've got the different colors. So these kind of structures. So the present simple is taught here, and different colors, and of course the order of the sentences. But it also enables them to complete the same tasks to do with probability in maths as other learners can. And similarly, in this resource from medieval towns, you can see that we've got a timeline, which means that we could teach here past tense throughout it. So we're focusing on the language here. And so you can also see in the another page from the same resource here, we've got different words from this topic, but you can see that there's space for translation here. So we are taking advantage of their home languages. But again, these kinds of approaches will allow learners to participate in the same lesson, just like everyone else. Okay, so now I'm just going to do one last section before I hand over to Glynis again. I would like you to, there's an function in Zoom called reactions. And if the answer to the question that I'm going to display to you in a second is yes, can you raise your hand in Zoom? So here's the question. Does your school carry out English language proficiency assessment of your learners using EAL? And I'll see how many, what's the number of those yeses come up. I'll give you maybe 30 seconds for that first question. Let's see. It should be a reaction and then a raise hand. Not seeing anyone yet. Hopefully it can work. Okay, I can see it now. So we've got about 85 of you, about between 80 and 90 who do. Okay, thank you very much. Now, a related question that of those of you who just put, if you could unraise your hand, so to speak. And then there is another related question, but only for those of you who have just raised your hands, which is, do you feel that the information gathered from such assessments effectively informs teaching and learning in your school? Okay, so about, yes. So 40, so about half of those of you who said that those assessments are carried out. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So perhaps from this, and given what we said about how assessment is important for informing the teaching, perhaps this could be one of your plans to try to introduce such assessments into your school. So I'm just going to do the last couple of slides about the assessment. So Strand and Hessel carried out a number of researches actually into this area, and they say that proficiency in English is central to understanding achievement and levels of need amongst pupils with EAL, and also that there is a strong link between proficiency in English and educational achievement. And that means that it is crucial that schools know the proficiency of in English of their learners. So we have the Bell Foundation EAL assessment framework for schools, which you can download for free from our website. It assesses how English is used in the mainstream classroom. It promotes formative assessments. It's designed to help plan and support learning. And as I just said, you can download it for free. I would just like to quickly state that it doesn't focus on aspects of grammar such as particular tenses or conditional sentences or subjunctives or anything of the sort. Rather, it focuses on language functions. So, for example, if you look at D there, can produce extended text. This is a descriptor from the framework. Here, the learner can produce extended text with an attempt to develop coherent arguments. So, developing coherent arguments is the language function. Now, how this is done, it could be done through a number of different grammatical and lexical, in a number of different grammatical and lexical ways, but rather we are simply interested is if they can do this particular language function, which will be important for the curriculum. And so we also have, in conjunction with the framework, support strategies. These are essentially lists of classroom strategies that are linked to the framework. So here you have Band B, which is the second lowest one, early acquisition. And you have a number of ideas for listening and speaking. And another here, as an example, is Band D, competence. So A being the lowest, E being the highest. A is new to English, E is fluent. So that's how the framework is organized. And we have a lot of guidance as well. So on our website, here is a selection of 3: effective teaching of the EAL, multilingual support, and working and welcoming with refugees and asylum seeking learners. And I'm going to now hand over to Glynis for the last section of those 3 focuses, and that's family liaison.
Thank you. So I want to share some practical strategies that you can use to support that for parents to support their children. And the first 2 really are things that should be done, or ideally would be done, in the days leading up to the student's first day at school, where you could meet with the family and the student, and first of all provide information about the curriculum and the teaching approaches that characterize education in the UK, because that might be very different from what they're used to. And for example, they might come from an education system that's very didactic, where students are not encouraged to express ideas and opinions, and where the teacher is the sole authority. So it'd be good to explain that there's a lot of collaborative learning that'll be happening, and that students are encouraged to think and express opinions. Secondly, you'd provide information in that meeting about your school, about timetables, about what happens at the beginning of the day, what happens at the end of the day, and so on, so that they're really quite prepared for that first day. You'd want to promote reading at home, and certainly in maintaining the languages that the learner knows and uses at home. And finally, in the days after the student has joined the school, to try and find opportunities to talk about the value of multilingualism with their parents, and how helpful it is to maintain the home language for their learning of the additional language. A second thing to look at would be what changes you would need to make sure that the way you communicate with parents is actually going to be helpful. And so you, as a coordinator, you would look at the effectiveness of your current communications, look at audio and video, is that going to work? Look at using text messages, which a family member could then translate, and also translating school letters into the languages that the family knows. And we'll share a useful resource for doing that. And another important aspect is to make sure that parents have a voice in your school community. Perhaps one parent could represent a group of families. And then lastly, looking at drawing in other family members, perhaps an older sibling who can help with translation, and so on. And then the last aspect would be to look at ways in which the school can offer more support to parents. Are you able to speak to parents more personally, perhaps on the phone, or inviting them into school for a conversation? If you could possibly arrange ESOL classes so that families, so that parents can learn English as well. making special arrangements for parents' evening, making sure that there's translation, for example, and opportunities for parents to ask questions. And then lastly, perhaps a specific parents' evening around English additional language.
Okay.
And that's me. So back to you, Camille.
Yes, so we know that we are starting to run over now, but it's only a few minutes, so hopefully you can stay for this last section, which is really just to let you know what we have on offer in terms of resources and things that could be useful to you. So first of all, there's a number of past webinars that you can access through our YouTube channel. So here's a selection of some. As you can see here, supporting new refugee arrivals there, maintaining high expectations of learners who use EAL, newly arrived pupils learning to English, and how parents can use home language to support the home learning and schoolwork of EAL pupils. These are just some. There's now over 40 different ones that we have on there. Secondly, this webinar is essentially an introduction to the topic, and we'll be running 2 webinars in February. You can see here the secondary one, EAL Coordinator leading on EAL in secondary schools, will be on the 2nd February. Also presented by myself and Glynis, and that will go into greater detail into areas such as EAL induction, assessments, and practical resources as well, just simply things that we do not have time in this first session today for, but we'll be investigating them closer, so hopefully you can come to that as well. And then also we have our online courses. There is, as you can see, 2 EAL assessment courses are coming up in January and February. Leading a whole school strategy for EAL is in March, and that could be for senior leaders or EAL coordinators who work with senior leaders on those longer term plans. And finally, understanding language for learning in multilingual schools is in April. Okay. Don't forget, we have our free resources on our website in the teaching resources section. You would need to register, but otherwise they are free. And here's just a selection of different resources that can be useful, particularly when working with new arrivals. So Racing to English is a CD with huge amounts of printable resources for new arrivals, particularly useful in induction programs, in my experience. Racing to Literacy is an EAL, free EAL program of phonics. So it was specifically designed for learners who use EAL. Learning Village is an online software that comes with an app that you could use in the classroom. And then the last 2, online background collation tool for new arrivals, is in fact a very useful tool that you could, it's a set of questions translated into a number of languages for parents who come for admission meetings into schools, and it's completely free. So give that a look, because hopefully that can be useful for you. And finally, if you want to send parents letters, then there are translated letters for schools, those sort of typical ones, like about absences or a school trip or those kinds of things. This one is for a primary context, but for this purpose, they tend to work quite well. I use them myself in my work as a secondary EAL coordinator, and they work perfectly well with our parents. And finally, some ideas for you to for reading. The EAL Coordinator first 100 Days of Schools by Nordic is a very, very useful publication, but you can see also other things you could engage with. And I think this is it. So I myself would like to. Sorry, Sheila, do you want to come in at this point?
No, thank you very much, Camille, both of you, Glynis and Camille. We want to thank you for a very insightful webinar today. I also want to say to all of you participants that you will be receiving an email tomorrow with the recording of this webinar. So I see that a lot of you were asking for copies of the PowerPoint slides, so that's how you will be getting those. And as you leave the webinar today, you will also receive a link that will ask you to do a quick feedback evaluation of the webinar. We really hope that you will take a few minutes to do that for us as it informs our practice. So anyway, again, thank you very much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Mhm.